The President and the Assassin, McKinley, Terror, and Empire at the Dawn of the American Century. By Scott Miller. Narrated by Arthur Morey. Copyright 2011 by Scott Miller. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Random House, an imprint of the Random House Publishing Group, a division of Random House Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. 1. Temple of Music. They streamed among the manicured flower beds and dewy lawns of Delaware Park that early September morning in Buffalo, New York, a portrait of America in the Gilded Age. Women in full-length skirts and tight-fitting corsets in the fashion of the iconic Gibson Girl shaded themselves with parasols. The men, seeking relief from the sun with jauntily perched straw boaters, fingered coins deep in their pockets, confident in their jobs. Children in sailors' suits skipped and laughed and pulled their parents along as fast as they could. The smoky aroma of grilling bratwurst, the echo of chirping piccolos and booming tubas, the bellow of an elephant, all signaled they had nearly reached the grounds of the Pan-American Exposition of 1901. As the crowds drew nearer, a series of pillars, each topped with a horse and rider, could be discerned through the trees. Beyond them stood massive domed buildings in red and yellow, followed by the stout triumphal bridge. The view was capped by the signature structure of the Expo, the 389-foot-high electric tower, lit with power generated by Niagara Falls 25 miles away. John M. Carriere, the Expo's lead architect, had carefully orchestrated the scene so that the spectator, as he approaches the exposition, will see it develop gradually until he reaches the bridge, when the entire picture will appear before him and almost burst upon him. Once inside the 350-acre park, visitors marveled at every sort of attraction: a mock Japanese village, a trip to the moon exhibit, where midgets served green cheese, and, of course, the pachyderm, a 9-ton specimen decorated by Queen Victoria for its service with the British Army in Afghanistan. It was an especially exciting day. The Buffalo papers were reporting that William McKinley, beloved President of the United States, would meet members of the public at the Temple of Music at 4 p.m. The previous day, a record 116,000 people had crowded through the gates to see him deliver what many considered one of his finest speeches, and the prospect of actually exchanging a handshake or a brief word was an experience not to be missed. Such one-on-one encounters were a favorite of the President. Meeting with people individually, he projected a natural sincerity and warmth. So much time did McKinley spend in receiving lines that he perfected his own handshake, the McKinley grip, to prevent cramping. When confronted with a long reception line, he made a point of extending his hand first and clasping the other's fingers so he couldn't be squeezed back. Then he would grab hold of his visitor's elbow with his left hand and deftly move him along, clocking up to 50 people a minute. "Everyone in that line has a smile and a cheery word," he once said. "They bring no problems with them, only goodwill. I feel better after the contact." But plans for this particular meet and greet had left McKinley's staff feeling uneasy. The event had been well publicized and raised serious security issues. George B. Cortelyou, the President's personal secretary, had twice removed the Temple of Music reception from McKinley's schedule, and the President had twice demanded that it be reinstated. Though McKinley was the most popular president since Abraham Lincoln 4 decades earlier, pockets of dangerous radicals lurked in many cities. Only weeks before, his Secret Service agent, George Foster, who looked the part of a professional sleuth with his derby hat and a cigar clenched between his teeth, had chased off a shadowy stranger from the McKinleys' private home in Canton, Ohio. Responding to pleas to be more cautious, the President conceded only to drawing his living room shades at night. Publishing tycoon William Randolph Hearst also tormented McKinley's inner circle with vicious attacks on the president. On April 10, 1901, his New York Journal printed an editorial that read in part, "If bad institutions and bad men can be got rid of only by killing, then the killing must be done." Cordeliew's nerves had been put even more on edge when, on the evening of September 4, 1901, the special three-car train the President and his wife were riding in pulled into the terrace station overlooking Lake Erie in Buffalo. Cannons set up by the Coast Guard to salute McKinley had been placed too near the tracks, and, when fired, produced a thunderous report that shattered 8 windows on the train and sent shards of glass flying inside. In a brief panic on the station platform, a dozen or so people, their minds quickly racing to the most likely assailant, shouted, "Anarchists!" The reaction was understandable. The notorious exploits of anarchists had become, in the minds of many citizens, a very real and horrifying threat to the American way of life. Anarchist newspapers printed directions for making explosives at home and preached the downfall of the U.S. government. Radical believers of the political philosophy that rejected authority in any form had committed a sickening stream of terrorist attacks on European kings and heads of state. In the United States, anarchists had been convicted of bombing the police and nearly succeeded in murdering the manager of the nation's largest steel company. The President, however, had never been one to worry about his own security and brushed aside pleas that he limit his exposure to the public. "No one would wish to hurt me," he chuckled. On the evening of August 31, 1901, a slightly built young man entered the barroom of John Novak's saloon at 1078 Broadway, on Buffalo's east side, and asked for a room. Clad in a gray suit with a black shoestring tie, he carried a telescope-shaped bag in one hand and a brown hat with a yellow ribbon in the other. He struck Novak as a fair sort of man, and possessed a dreamy look. The guest paid the rate of $2 a week. "What name shall I write on the receipt?" Novak asked. "John Doe," the man replied. Novak, accustomed to guests of questionable breeding, thought it somewhat odd, but didn't care what he called himself as long as he paid in advance. Novak asked Frank Volkowiak, a clerk at the hotel who was studying law, to show the man to a room on the second floor. Volkowiak was more curious than his boss. "What made you say John Doe?" he asked as they trudged upstairs. "Well, I'll tell you. I'm a Polish Jew, and I didn't like to tell him or he wouldn't keep me in the house." Pressing the point, Volkowiak asked the guest his real name. "Nieman. Fred Nieman. I'm going to sell souvenirs." Nobody could figure out what the man who called himself Nieman was really doing in Buffalo. He generally rose early and left the hotel for the day. In the evening he would return with a collection of newspapers tucked under his arm, the Express, the Courier, the Times, the Commercial, and head straight to his room. He occasionally bought a cigar or a good whiskey, not the cheap 5-cent shots, and stopped once or twice to watch a card game in the barroom, but he hardly ever spoke. The only time anyone paid him any attention was one morning when he noisily searched for a water pitcher, disturbing a retired German army officer trying to sleep in a nearby room. Stuffed deep in his coat pocket, however, was one artifact that indicated a keen interest in world affairs, a neatly folded and well-worn newspaper clipping about the assassination of Italian King Umberto I. An Italian-American named Gaetano Bresci, an editor of an anarchist newspaper in New Jersey, had murdered the monarch a year earlier. Nieman read it carefully. Sometime during the first week of September he stopped by Walbridge Hardware at 316 Main Street and asked to see a silver-plated Iver Johnson .32 caliber revolver, the same model that Bresci had used against Umberto I. At $4.50, the weapon was priced well above the other handguns that ran closer to $1.50, but he couldn't resist acquiring the premium model. Back in his hotel room, He loaded the weapon with 5 Smith & Wesson cartridges and practiced wrapping the gun and his right hand in a white handkerchief. At 58, McKinley was still handsome enough for his looks to be a campaign asset. His square jaw and strong cheekbones projected an air of confidence and purpose that suited an increasingly ambitious nation. His large head, some political friends thought, resembled that of Napoleon Bonaparte's, and they took to referring to him as such. In figure and form, McKinley was very much in keeping with amply proportioned men of the day. At a scant 5 feet 6½ inches, he made a point of insisting the last half-inch be recorded. He sometimes seemed that large around. He might have shed a few pounds, but exercise, other than a brisk stroll in the evenings, had never been a priority. Several years before, McKinley had tried to take up golf, but gave it up. Too much walking. McKinley's most distinguishing feature, however, was his piercing dark eyes that conveyed a genuine goodness of spirit. The habitual expression of his face is one of gravity and kindness, the Review of Reviews wrote in 1896. If the phrase did not sound too sentimental, the fittest words to characterize McKinley's look would be a sweet seriousness. McKinley, the magazine continued, always had a kind word for secretaries or servants, and would see off visitors to the door of his Canton home to warn them about the steps. Longtime Republican stalwart and diplomat John Hay would write years later to a friend, "The President was one of the sweetest and quietest natures I have ever known among public men." Journalists who had the opportunity to see the President on a daily basis from desks set up near his second-floor office were likewise struck by McKinley's unfailing affability. Frequently stopping for brief chats, one hand in a pants pocket, the other twirling his glasses, he would ask after any who were missing that day and inquire about their health. McKinley awoke the morning of September 6, 1901, in an energetic mood. Staying at the stately home of Expo President John G. Milburn, he rose early and made certain he was dressed to the teeth. A boiled shirt, iron-starched collar and cuffs, black satin cravat, piqué vest, pinstriped trousers, and frock coat. Into his pockets he stuffed enough trinkets to fill a small jewelry box, including a gold watch and pencil, a wallet, $1.20 in small change, 3 knives, 9 keys, several loose, others on 2 rings, a pair of gloves and 3 handkerchiefs, because it was supposed to be a warm day. At 7 a.m., much to the consternation of his security detail, McKinley set off on a 20-minute walk along Delaware Avenue, one of the most beautiful streets in Buffalo, enjoying the air and the fine homes. Invigorated by the exercise, he and his wife Ida then departed on a sightseeing trip to Niagara Falls, where he clambered about like a boy. His hosts, eager to please their esteemed guest, had arranged for a hearty lunch at the International Hotel and left enough time in his schedule for the President to cap the midday meal with a favorite cigar. By mid-afternoon he had boarded his special train of parlor cars for the trip back to the Expo, relaxing as farmland and fruit trees passed outside his window. At the Temple of Music, the main concert hall of the Expo, staff had been preparing all morning for the President's arrival. Security and crowd control were top concerns, but seemed to have been addressed. Lewis Babcock, a Buffalo attorney and Grand Marshal of the Exposition, had arranged chairs to form a wide aisle to direct people from the east entrance to the dais, and then to corral them out the temple's south doorways. Babcock's men had also constructed a wooden blind behind the dais to protect the President from the rear, upon which they hung a large American flag. Potted bay trees and other small plants were collected from around the Expo and placed on the edge of the stage, where Secret Service agents were to stand as they studied those in line for strange behavior or a hidden weapon. Before getting anywhere near the President, visitors would have to file between 2 columns of soldiers, who were also ordered to scrutinize each individual. At noon, their work complete, Babcock, Buffalo attorney James L. Quackenbush, and another fair organizer gathered for a lunch of sandwiches and Pilsner beer, pleased with their preparations. Referring to Theodore Roosevelt, the ambitious vice president, Quackenbush was confident enough to quip, "It would be Roosevelt's luck to have McKinley shot today." As the three lingered over their meal, a line began to form at the temple's east entrance, spilling out onto the esplanade. Well-wishers balanced on swollen feet for hours under a searing sun, avoiding the temptation of the comfortable chairs in the nearby Pabst restaurant where a seltzer and lemon sold for 30 cents. The afternoon was so warm and humid that by 3 o'clock the Expo ambulance would pick up 3 cases of heat exhaustion on the fairgrounds. If Neiman was suffering from the heat, he kept it to himself and arrived early enough to secure a place near the front of the line. He looked, some later said, like a tradesman or mechanic on holiday, though he hardly stood out. Waiting just in front of him was a dark-haired Italian-looking man. Directly behind was James Parker, a slender 6'4" black waiter from Atlanta. Naturally gregarious, Parker tried once or twice to strike up a conversation with Neiman, but was rebuffed. Shortly before 4 o'clock, McKinley's Victorian carriage pulled up to the Temple of Music, and he emerged still unseen by the crowds of people that waited for him at the other entrance. The temple, which from a distance resembled a red, yellow, and blue Fabergé egg, was an impressive structure. Able to accommodate an audience of more than 2,000, it hosted famous musicians playing daily concerts. Striding toward the dais, the music-loving president might have noticed the building's impressive pipe organ, an $18,000 Emmons Howard that was one of the largest ever made. Now shown to his place, McKinley turned to his security men and gave the order, "Let them come." On cue, organist William J. Gompf coaxed the massive organ to life with a tasteful Bach sonata. The doors to the east entrance were thrown open, and excitement rippled through the waiting crowd, many murmuring in hushed tones as they shuffled along on the pine floors. The first to reach the president was Dr. Clinton Colgrove of Holland, New York. "George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and President McKinley," he declared. Several children followed. To every child the president bent over, shook hands warmly, and said some kind words, wrote a young newspaper reporter, John D. Wells. One boy broke from his mother's hand to dash to the president's side. His horrified mother arrived seconds later, but McKinley, who loved children, brushed off the breach of protocol and complimented the boy's enthusiasm. Not far behind, Parker was growing irritated with Neiman, who seemed to be shuffling along. "If you can't go faster, at least let me by," Parker said. Again he was ignored. All the while nobody, not the police guard, not the soldiers, not the Secret Service, asked Neiman to remove his right hand from his front coat pocket. The Italian-looking man in front of him had captured their attention. With his tussle of dark hair, olive skin, and mustache, he fit the prevailing stereotype of an immigrant anarchist. The suspect created a further distraction when he would not quickly let go of the president's hand, and Secret Service agent Samuel Ireland had to intervene. Once extricated, McKinley turned toward Neiman, smiled warmly, and extended his right hand. Neiman took a step forward. Standing only a foot away, he withdrew a bulging handkerchief from his pocket and shoved it toward the president's ribs. McKinley and the man who called himself Neiman lived in parallel yet vastly different worlds. Each could see that the Industrial Revolution was forever changing a nation that had long been proud of its simple agrarian roots. Farmers were abandoning their plows for jobs in clanking, hissing factories. Steamy cities, powered by desperately hopeful immigrants, clawed into the countryside, and lording over it all was a new breed of American, the rapacious Wall Street tycoon. For McKinley, these were signs of progress. A prosperous nation was a happy one, and he would do what he could to encourage America's growing economic might. The strongest, most fit companies were allowed to gobble up the weakest, until vast swaths of the economy were ruled by a handful of men who understood no economic law other than to produce as much as their straining factories could stand. And when there were no longer enough consumers in the United States to soak up everything that filled the shops and new mail-order catalogs, McKinley attempted to help by establishing new markets abroad. The United States proceeded to acquire foreign territories with all the skill and grace of a hungry Labrador retriever eating dinner, at once sloppy, excited, ravenous, clumsy, and oblivious. Under McKinley, the United States lurched at the chance to snatch victory in the Caribbean and the Pacific, annex Hawaii, and begin what would become a familiar pattern of sending troops to foreign shores to defend American interests. Bursting with confidence and pride, an almost giddy nation realized it was on the cusp of joining the traditional powers, England, France, and more recently Germany, as a nation of first rank, one whose companies would dominate world markets and whose missionaries would spread its Protestant work ethic and way of life to a grateful planet. The concept of running an empire, long despised in this former colony, came to be coveted by some as a reward bestowed by the Almighty Himself on a deserving people. Yet in all the excitement, some saw a nation that had turned its back on its values. The United States had become, they felt, a country owned by the rich and governed only with their interests in mind. The expansion depended on a swelling army of low-skilled workers like Neiman, people who toiled at jobs that often didn't provide a subsistence wage, without hope of advancement or much of anything beyond an early grave. The American economy had come to resemble Frankenstein's monster, both in power and incomprehensibility, wrote historian John Garrity. Workers, businessmen, professional economists, and political leaders could neither control nor even understand the mighty forces they pretended to supervise and employ. This combination of raw suffering in the workers' tenements and indifference in the mansions of the ruling elite created a fertile breeding ground for a class of social radical who came to see the dynamite stick and the pistol as the only way to break the cycle of servitude. The most notorious of these were the anarchists, who sometimes working in small groups, other times alone, were perfectly willing to resort to terror to redress society's evils. In diametrically opposed ways, McKinley and Neiman heard in these tumultuous times a calling each believed could change history. This is the story of how they answered. 2. O God, keep him humble. The curious, as well as the committed, came by the trainload to Canton, Ohio, throughout the summer of 1896 to see the Republican Party's candidate for president. Neatly dressed local volunteers with welcoming smiles assembled the delegations of miners, tradespeople, streetcar drivers, and soldiers, as well as bankers, lawyers, doctors, and college students, and marched through the center of town and toward the McKinley home. By the thousands they strutted to the beat of brass bands and patriotic melodies. Chanting, waving banners, and tooting horns, the throngs surged up Market Avenue North, as thick as flies around a railroad pie stand, until they passed beneath the McKinley Arch, a plaster structure crowned with the candidate's likeness. Down the tree-lined street and past souvenir stands selling buttons, canes, and umbrellas, they made their way toward McKinley's Victorian home at number 723. It was, in the words of one, as if every day were the 4th of July. As the din of each delegation grew louder, McKinley would wait in his office just off the downstairs hall and review the day's scheduled visitors, warned of their imminent arrival by a runner who monitored the train station. The candidate would then emerge from the front door, climb atop a sturdy chair, and greet the enthusiastic crowd. It was a deliberately engineered stage, with McKinley's tasteful yet modest home serving as a picture-perfect backdrop. Gingerbread woodwork hung from the high peaked roof. Large windows, shutters thrown open, looked out on a lawn that, at the start of the campaign, was said to be among the most immaculate in town. White urns spilled over with flowers, brilliant red geraniums lined a walk leading to a covered porch that shaded wicker chairs and rockers. McKinley's mother, Nancy, served lemonade with Ida. The candidate would occasionally interrupt the speech to shout a warm greeting across the fence to a neighbor girl, Mary Harter, gawking at the crowds. The McKinley home quickly filled up with a trove of gifts. Watermelons, cheese, canes, flags, cakes, and clothing were all stored in a back room for the staff to rummage through. Tons of flowers went in the trash heap. A group from Tennessee brought a finely polished tree stump, on which McKinley would later deliver campaign speeches. Another brought the largest plate of galvanized iron ever rolled in the United States, and yet another brought a record-breaking sheet of tin 60 feet long, with the names of the candidates on it. 5 bald eagles were bestowed, which McKinley hastily gave to the zoo in Nemesilla Park. On one occasion, an army of bicyclists riding 2, 4, and 6 abreast performed in intricate formations outside McKinley's home, saluting him by dismounting and raising the front wheels of their bikes. Under the constant drumbeat of feet, the front yard looked by the end of the summer as if a herd of buffalo had passed that way. Eager visitors completely demolished the fence, as well as the grape arbor. The velvety lawn quickly wore away, balding to clay that was hard and shiny. Souvenir hunters stripped the front porch. In one day alone, 16 delegations from 12 states arrived. All told, between June 19th and November 2nd, 1896, nearly 750,000 people in 300 delegations from 30 states made the pilgrimage to the McKinley porch. The newspapers dubbed it the Front Porch Campaign. There would be no whistle-stop tours, no speeches in crowded halls, and no heated rallies in borderline states. Voters would have to come to him. The strategy suited McKinley's strengths as well as his weaknesses. Mark Hanna, his energetic campaign manager, tried to paint the decision to stay home as evidence of McKinley's qualification for office. Mr. McKinley will continue to conduct himself as a man who appreciates the dignity and importance of the office he seeks. He will not lend himself to any catch-penny scheme for the sake of satisfying the curious or making himself talked about. There was no doubt a large element of truth to Hanna's claim. Proper manners and comportment were as much a part of McKinley as his ample girth. McKinley also saw practical reasons to stay close to home. As a public speaker, he was no match for William Jennings Bryan, his loquacious Democratic rival. "I might just as well put up a trapeze on my front lawn and compete with some professional athlete as go out speaking against Bryan," McKinley told members of his campaign staff. "I have to think when I speak." That so many people traveled so far to hear him said much about his appeal. As a Republican, McKinley was undeniably the candidate of the nation's moneyed interests, men in top hats and dark European suits who controlled so much wealth and were so despised for it. Yet McKinley also possessed a surprising knack for reaching out to the common man, able to speak his language, and, maybe most important, able to show he shared his humble roots. Born the 7th of 9 children in 1843, William McKinley, Jr. started life in Niles, Ohio, far from the corridors of power. About 65 miles southeast of Cleveland, Niles was little more than a wide spot in the road, albeit a bucolic one. Farms dotted the rolling hills outside town, where a young McKinley relished the simple pleasures of standing barefoot on earth warmed by a recently resting cow, roaming the woods with a bow and arrow, or flying his beloved kite. The Mosquito Creek, where McKinley and another boy had once nearly drowned, meandered nearby. A tree-lined, unpaved street marked the center of the village. 3 churches, as many as there were stores, served a population of 300. The McKinley home, a 2-story clapboard, graced a corner lot adjoining a grocery store. Regularly whitewashed with a steeply gabled roof and curtains neatly adorning the windows, it radiated middle-class propriety. McKinley's father, of tough Scottish-Irish stock, was a powerfully built jack-of-all-trades, who supported the family by managing the blast furnace that, along with a rolling mill and a nail forge, constituted the backbone of the Niles economy. As in many frontier households, and Ohio was considered the frontier in those days, It was the woman of the house who assumed the role of parent in chief. Mother McKinley, as she was affectionately known among townsfolk, embodied all that was good.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?